Welcome to our discussion on achieving racial equity in North Carolina's legal system. I'm Bruce Elmore, and I'm president of the Western North Carolina chapter of the ACLU of North Carolina. If you belong to the ACLU and live in Western North Carolina and want to become active in our chapter, feel free to email me at bae9797@yahoo.com. Let me now go ahead and introduce our moderator for tonight, Henderson Hill. Henderson joined the ACLU as senior counsel of the Capital Punishment Project after his decades-long service as a public defender, director of the North Carolina Death Penalty Project Resource Center, a partner at the civil rights law firm Ferguson Stein Chambers, and director of the Federal Defenders of Western North Carolina. Most recently, he launched and continues to serve as co-director of Redress NC, an initiative to unwind extreme sentences through collaboration with community stakeholders, most principally moderate to progressive district attorneys. Henderson's a graduate of Lehman College, CUNY, and Harvard Law School. He's taught courses on trial advocacy at UNC, Duke, and Harvard, as well as internationally. He's lectured widely on trial skills, death penalty jurisprudence, and death penalty abolition. In 2007, he was inducted as a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. And before I turn it over to you, Henderson, let me just encourage people in the audience to know that after you ask questions of the panelists, that there'll be time for question and answer, and encourage people to use the chat function. So go ahead, Henderson.
Sorry, I was muted. I was just thanking you, Bruce, and the Western chapter of the ACLU. It's great to be with the circle. You've assembled a wonderful panel for an important discussion. What a topic, racial equity in the criminal legal system. This panel, you won't be surprised, will be looking for transformation, and what that means as opposed to reform is going to take up a goodly part of this conversation. But to the panels, let me introduce you to Justice Anita Earls. Prior to her election in the North Carolina Supreme Court in 2018, Justice Earls founded and led the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, an organization that believes that families and communities engaged in social justice struggles need a team of lawyers, advocates, social scientists, community organizers, and media specialists to support them in their efforts to dismantle structural racism and oppression. Growing up in a mixed race family, Justice Earls recognized early on the racial inequalities that were present in her own community. Watching her father earn less as a urological technician than his white counterparts. She went on to attend Williams College, where she became involved in the Student Anti-Apartheid Coalition, the Center for Development Economics, and other organizations that nourished her commitment to social equality and civil rights. After working for the Department of Justice, Justice Earls returned to North Carolina, eventually founding the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. We thank you for all of that, Justice Earls. And Mutaba Muhammad, Senator Mutaba Muhammad is a longtime Charlotte resident. He was born in the United States to two hardworking immigrant parents from India and raised under modest means. Mutaba's mother and father taught him the importance of putting family before self, helping others, and appreciating the simple blessings in life. It was this belief in giving priority to family and community that led Mutaba to pursue a career in public interest law and a life dedicated to serving those in need. I read slower than most, so Mutaba, I'm going to cut down some of your introduction and get to the others in the panel. But you should know that in addition to defending the rights of the underprivileged in the courtroom and fighting to connect low-income families to the services they need every day, Mutaba continues to demonstrate his commitment to children and families through his past and current service on the boards of directors of local nonprofit organizations. Mutaba's passion and work for equity, fairness, and opportunities for all led to North Carolina's Governor Roy Cooper appointing him to the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities and North Carolina's Task Force for Racial Equity in Criminal Justice. That's an appointment we're going to hear more about. Mutaba's proven record of service to children and families led to his election to the North Carolina State Senate in 2018, where he is working to ensure every family and child has a chance to a brighter economic future. Thank you, Mutaba. Dr. Felicia Arriaga, for the 2021-2022 academic year, Dr. Arriaga is a visiting research scholar at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, teaching race, power, and inequality, and race and public policy. She is also a tenure-track assistant professor of sociology in the criminology concentration at Appalachian State University in Boone. Her research interests are in the areas of race and ethnicity, immigration, and crimmigration. That is the criminalization of immigration policy and procedure. She is originally from Western North Carolina, I hear Hendersonville, and completed her undergraduate, master's degree, and PhD in sociology at Duke University. She considers herself a public sociologist and hopes that her scholarship and community work will contribute to more fruitful discussions around crimmigration policies. She is especially interested in how these policies and procedures relate to issues of criminal justice, accountability, transparency, and reform. Thank you, Dr. Arriaga. Robert Thomas, a native of Asheville, is an experienced community leader and an expert on the inequities of the criminal justice system. He is a former justice-involved individual himself and understands the negative impacts and disparities faced by people of color in the carceral system. With over 10 years of direct experience, Robert has now narrowed his focus to racial justice, decarceration, and activism around police accountability that was brought to the attention of residents following the killing of George Floyd and many others. In addition, Robert is a community liaison for the Racial Justice Coalition of Asheville and a partner of minority-owned equity consulting firm. Robert, thank you for all that you do. What a great panel. I'm anxious to get the discussion going. And Dr. Arriaga, we're going to start with you. If you can just sort of get us acclimated into the topic and share with us a little background and the racial disparities in North Carolina's carceral system. What are we talking about?
Yeah, sure. And this is such a large question, so I'm sure my fellow panelists will dive in here. I also wanted to take a little time to spotlight some of the areas in Western North Carolina, because I do think it's important for us to know sort of what we're working with, right? It's hard to think about this at such a state level whenever we have sort of very specific populations that for each sort of city and locality. So I also want to start by thinking through just how people come in contact with the criminal legal system in the first place. So some of the statistics that I pulled are really going to be specific through that process. So I think for many of us, we have the ability to look at this information too and try to understand what this picture looks like for our city and our counties. So if you're all interested, we can sort of start by thinking about, most of the time we're actually coming in contact with the criminal legal system through something as simple as a traffic stop, right? Or some kind of traffic sort of enforcement. And so I pulled some of the statistics for the Asheville City Police, and I'm happy to drop all of this information in the chat later on. But thinking about that, we do see, at least in some traffic stops for the Asheville Police Department, some small disparities, especially when it comes to the Black motorist. We also see that sort of percentage, the disparity increases for Black folks as we sort of look at searches of those motorists, as well as use of force. And so we can think about that as just one way to start to think about this process some person might go through as we sort of go through the criminal legal system. As far as the jail population in North Carolina, we also know that even though Black people make up 23% of the population, of the general population in North Carolina, they make up 48% of the jail population across the state. And so we clearly see that that is disproportionate to their population numbers, right? And we can talk about maybe different metrics to think about that too. We see that that's similar for the prison population as well. About 52% of folks in the prison population are Black. And I want to make that distinction too, because I think so much of my research and what community members feel like they have a bit more power to control is some of these local policies, right? Some of the policing pieces, some of the sort of impacting jail and some of the sheriff sort of policies that get put into place. And then we can sort of think about too, there's been the Vera Research Institute did some research specifically back in 2015, looking more specifically at jail populations across the state. And we also see that places like in Ashe County, which is in Western North Carolina, their jail population increased from 515% from 2005 to 2015, right? So this is also something that we're seeing in rural counties, that the jail populations are increasing. And you have to sort of dig deeper to be able to understand what that means for different racial groups, right? And so I would say that obviously we're here today to talk about sort of the equity issues or sort of inequality when it comes to the criminal justice system, but I'll also say that this doesn't just impact people of color, right? This impacts white people, especially if we're thinking about more rural places that maybe have more white population and people who are living in those places as well. I think from there, if you're thinking about someone being sort of incarcerated, especially in the jail or being incarcerated at the prison, you can think about also what exactly are they being held for, and also consider what's the likelihood of them actually being let out, right? Especially pre-trial. That's often what we'll be discussing, I think, on this sort of panel too, is thinking about what is sort of the conditions during sort of pre-trial detention or that time period before sort of their cases actually finalized and finished up. And so in some counties that like McDowell County, which is here in Western North Carolina, that 82.3% of the folks who are in pretrial detention are also being held on secured bond, meaning that they're being held typically on some kind of financial, like they're encouraged, or the rationale there is that there's going to be some kind of financial component that they're going to have to pay to be able to actually get out, right? And so we can think about that comparison in comparison to sort of the other sort of counties across the state, where we also see some variation even in Western North Carolina, where we do also have some counties like Cherokee County, where 51.8% of those folks are being held on secured bonds, right? So we can see there's a difference across jurisdictions and across their localities, even in Western North Carolina. So it's important for us to just think about, I won't spend too much time on the other sort of areas, but I think we should also consider what the disparities look like when it comes to reentry, whether or not people have access to services as they actually transition out of the carceral system at that point too. And we also know that some of the great work from Disability Rights North Carolina, who's looked at when Black people are incarcerated, that they're actually more likely to be held in high security maximum control, and also in restrictive housing for control purposes, right? So often things that we talk about as solitary confinement. So it's really important for us to just follow all of these things as a person might sort of go through the criminal legal system. I think the one thing that I'm probably most passionate about and have sort of started working in this area was really based on looking at sort of ICE enforcement and what that looked like, especially in Western North Carolina. I grew up in Henderson County. And so for me, most of my research really started looking at how this particular immigration enforcement partnership started out in Henderson County. We've sort of talked about it in different jurisdictions across the state as well. But I think it's also really important for us to consider what that does for law enforcement community relationships when we do have some of these types of partnerships that are happening. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to sort of take some other questions and also drop a bunch of the sort of information that I also discussed.
Thank you, Dr. Arriaga. The western part of the state is complicated geographically on issues of diversity. I remember going to courtrooms as far west as Murphy, where the African-American population is so minuscule, but on calendar call, amazingly, they found 30 or 40% of the docket to be African-American young men. I think some of the complexities that you talked about, Dr. Arriaga, is going to inform the rest of our conversation this evening. Justice Earls, it'd be helpful if you would share with us what you believe to be some of the critical policy changes that have to be made in North Carolina. And don't be shy to discuss your role in the task force that has gained a lot of attention throughout the state.
Well, thank you so much, Henderson. I'm really grateful to the ACLU Western North Carolina for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm so eager to be in discussion with such amazing advocates and co-panelists. And you forgot to tell people that you and I were law partners. That's probably the most important thing to know about my biography. But I did actually start my work in the late 1980s doing criminal defense work in Charlotte. And so from that early role until now, I would say from my perspective, there are three really important things I think we have to focus on. And you know, the governor's task force was created specifically in the wake of the demonstrations in the summer of 2020 following George Floyd's murder. And yet there were criminal justice reform efforts underway in the state before that, focusing on things like the impact of fines and fees, the need for bail reform. You know, there's been a lot of activity in the state long before the task force. And the task force came up with 125 recommendations. They're all important, but sometimes I worry that we will get lost amongst the trees and not really see the forest. So so the three things I want to try to keep a focus on is one, we need strong accountability measures for police forces. And I think that in this state, we have not achieved that yet. And so the task force had a number of recommendations, including things like giving the Attorney General the power to bring a prosecution if the local district attorney won't. But we need independent and strong accountability measures that we don't have yet. And I say that also coming from someone who spent the first 10 years of my career representing the families of people who were killed by police officers. And without exception, well, maybe one exception, these were African-American and women as well, African-American, mostly African-American men, mostly young men, but not exclusively, and sometimes women. And this was before the days of videotape, cell phones, body cams. This was before all of that. So proving those cases was enormously hard. But my point is just that we don't have sufficient accountability right now, structures. And that creates all sorts of perverse incentives and results in situations where justice doesn't happen. The second thing I focus on is that we need to keep people out of the system. And so there, I actually think the recommendation to decriminalize marijuana possession would be, and some of the other decriminalization recommendations in the report, but generally we get too many people into the system for things that just aren't in any way dangerous to society, or it's not making us any safer when people get arrested for misdemeanor possession of marijuana. So that's the second big thing. And then I think the third thing that we need to focus on is that we are keeping people in the system way too long. And so there, whether it's the power of prosecutors that come from having the habitual offender charge, or the one statistic you didn't give that I keep in mind is the fact that 91% of the people who were sentenced to juvenile life without parole were children of color in this state. And we continue to have large numbers of juvenile, a huge racial disproportionality. And so these are people who are getting, yes, they happen in very awful crimes, but they also come for children who've experienced numerous life traumas. And so there are a number of ways in which our system just keeps people incarcerated way too long. And one of the things that I take away from the task force testimony was just the distorting effect that the availability of capital punishment has on all of the criminal justice system. So not just people who might be facing a death penalty, but the possibility of the death penalty also infects the rest of how charges are handled by prosecutors. So those three things are uppermost in our mind. But I would finally say that the task force was created to exist for 2 years, 2.5 years. That's not long enough. We need a permanent entity, and we should think about, task force. We actually have no power, right? And so the notion that this body of people are going to come together and they have no ability to pass laws by themselves, they have no ability to enforce laws by themselves, they can't change what prosecutors do, recognizing all of the different levels at which this system operates, whether it's, local magistrates deciding who gets bond, to the statewide prison system deciding, and the parole system deciding who gets released. There's a multiplicity of decision makers, a multiplicity of systems, and it's a huge undertaking. And one of the crucial things is keeping data. Like, we need data on all of these points at which people interact with the system in order to monitor whether any of these reforms we're putting in place actually improve things for people of color, actually get us closer to racial equity. One of the presentations we had from New Jersey talked about how they have eliminated cash bail in New Jersey, but they have not eliminated the racial disparities of who gets put in jail. They've lowered the jail population, good thing, but they still have racial disparities. So there's obviously an enormous amount to do, but I try to stay focused on some of the big picture items.
Thank you, Justice Earle. I think it shouldn't go without noting that your role as a co-chair with the Attorney General was so important in keeping the task force focused on not being overwhelmed. Clearly, the mission was an overwhelming mission, but to organize 25 community citizens, community leaders to focus on the many ways in which the system was doing exactly the opposite of justice was so important. I thank you, and I thank the Attorney General for those efforts. Like Dr. Arriaga, you've identified a couple of issues that are important and that we should give some focus to. Mutaba, Senator Mohammed, you also were on that task force. You saw the length and breadth of some of the recommendations, policy changes that are essential to transforming a system. How would you identify a set of policies that would be critical to achieving transformation?
Sure. So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And again, also, I want to thank ACLU and the Western North Carolina chapter. It's great to be here with Henderson Hill from our task force. And of course, our amazing Chief Justice, or Justice Earls, not Chief Justice yet, but maybe someday. But it's an honor and privilege to be here with each all of you and our other distinguished panel members. Look, Henderson, what I will say is you did an introduction about me earlier. Yes, I'm a public interest attorney. That's my background. Proud to have started my career representing children at the Council for Children's Rights, also been a public defender. I'm also a state senator, and I say my number one obligation and responsibility is the health, safety, and well-being of every single citizen across this great state. And that means reimagining public safety. That's where we have to start. That means that it's incredibly frustrating that when you and I turn on our television sets or turn on social media, time and time again, we hear and see phrases and voices saying, "I can't breathe. Please don't kill me. I'm about to die." And that's incredibly frustrating. And the reality is these desperate outcomes specifically hurt people of color. I mean, the fact that we know who George Floyd is because of those very words. When he was choked to death, murdered in broad daylight for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The reason we know who Keith Lamont Scott is, the reason we know who Breonna Taylor is, the reason we know now about Anthony Brown Jr. in North Carolina. It's because that these folks had to pay the ultimate price of being Black in America with their lives. And that's something that we have to acknowledge. So we've got to send a clear message to our community, and that includes everyone. That means our Black and brown citizens in North Carolina as well, that we see you, we hear you, and that we stand by you. And we are going to do everything that we can to shift from a warrior mentality when it comes to our law enforcement agencies and shift to that guardian mentality. So we've got to do more work when it comes to police practices and accountabilities, things like banning chokeholds, something that the task force talked about, but something we haven't done statutorily. There's so many other things that we can talk about. I'm looking forward to talking about duty to intervene and duty to render aid, some other things we've also come up with. But that also means that we also have to acknowledge that all police officers are not bad people, right? I work in the justice system. There's some great police officers, and policing is a very difficult job. So we've got to do everything that we can to make sure that we have amazing, outstanding police officers in our community building relationships. That means allocating funds to make sure we have police officers that are well funded and supported. That means adequate training for community policing. That means implicit bias training for law enforcement officers, reforms to our use of forms, making sure that our police officers are mentally fit. Those are all critical things that we have to look at. And that means supporting the law enforcement community with those appropriate investments and making those appropriate reforms. Other things that I look at is how do we make sure that we're building people in North Carolina instead of building prisons? How do we end that school to prison pipeline? And again, I told you I started my legal career representing children at the Council for Children's Rights, young children who I have followed into the adult criminal justice system. That means we're still failing kids. At the end of the day, we are pushing our children out of our classrooms into jail cells. So we still have much more to do when it comes to reforming our juvenile justice system. You know, North Carolina, for those out there listening, was the last state in the country to do that on December 1st, 2019. When we finally reformed our juvenile justice system to end the prosecution of 16 and 17-year-olds in the adult criminal justice system. But we had carve-outs for that. Shame on us. Shame on us. And then we did that again now with Senate Bill 207. We attempted, the task force made recommendations about raising the age of jurisdiction for prosecution of children. North Carolina, again, the youngest state in the country with laws on the books prosecuting children as young as 6. Number of states are doing it at 10 or 12. But we had to compromise in a Republican-dominated state legislature. We got that to 10. But again, we saw a carve out there. So we've got to figure out better ways to prepare our children, keep them in the classroom, and prepare them for a global economy. And then the other things I'll tell you is also along what you heard Justice Earls talk about, Dr. Arriaga, is really looking at how our courts and jails and fines and fees contribute to our criminal justice system not being a very just justice system. Folks need to realize that the number of folks in our criminal justice system are there for non-violent offenses. And they're sitting in jail cells because they don't have the money. So they lose their jobs, they lose their housing. And now, unfortunately, that becomes an issue for public safety for the whole community. So here you have the justice system contributing time and time again to a terrible criminal justice system. When we look at court fines and fees, someone pointed out Senate Bill 490. I appreciate the shout out. It's a bill that we sponsored in the North Carolina Senate. It passed in the Senate. It's sitting in the North Carolina House. But there are hundreds and thousands of people in North Carolina that don't have a driver's license simply because they can't pay their court fees and fines. That's a problem. Again, that's creating collateral consequences for jobs and housing. This is where government is again in the way. So we've got to be a much more compassionate, responsive, and effective government. So, but those are some of my biggest priorities. But I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit about our work on the task force and some of the bills that we have been able to get passage and reforms on. Thanks, Henderson.
Thank you, Senator Mohammed. If I didn't emphasize enough your career in the legislature at the task force, the legislature was in fact the target of many of the recommendations and the struggle to change, to transform. And part of the problem is the political process that comes to a head at the legislature. We'll certainly have an opportunity to talk about that more. Mr. Thomas, Rob, you were not on the task force, but your perspective about this challenge, about the system that denies fairness and opportunity to huge swaths of the community is something that we'd like to get your perspective on at this initial setting of the table. Please share your perspective on these important issues.
Yes, sir. In order to get to my perspective, I'm gonna have to take us back and pull us away and look down from a bird's eye view on the situation, right? Criminal justice is one part of a conglomeration of inequitable systems, and all these systems work in concert. And it's kind of hard for me to think about how we're going to decrease disparities inside of the criminal justice system without focusing on all the other systems with the massive amount of disparities in it as well. And I just, I don't see us throwing a whole bunch of funding or policy changes inside of criminal justice and expecting disparities to decrease, whereas I myself went through the system at a very early age. So let's look at the whole situation, right? You pull yourself back and you see that you've got an education system with massive disparities that is also tied to the criminal justice system, whereas the criminal justice system takes a lot of the parents out of the lives of individuals inside the education system, which then creates high ACEs scores, adverse childhood experiences, and it all correlates. And then you have housing discrimination for Black and Brown individuals. And then you have economic mobility and discriminatory practices and extremely racist environments inside of everyday workplaces. And so you have individuals that are geared towards criminal activity. Then our healthcare system at the same time, you have discrimination, you have blatant disregard of individuals needing health. Individuals are dying because they can't afford their diabetic medication and things of that nature. Less known, receiving the proper treatment for psychological issues that usually sometimes leads to incarceration because they haven't been managed, maintained, or proper medication has not been received. And then you also have the three different areas of where you encounter the criminal justice system. You've got law enforcement, you've got the courtroom, and then you have prison itself. And there's a massive amount of issues within all of these areas. So now we're at the bird's eye view of things, right? All these things working in concert. You're not just gonna pick out one area and change disparities in one area because they all work together. You're not gonna fix the opportunity/achievement gap without working on housing, economic mobility, criminal justice, and each system is structured therein the same. And so, and I'm not saying this to say that the reforms aren't good, because the reforms, I believe, will change life outcomes that might have not had changed had these policies and reforms been implemented. But what I want to get to before I get us down into the micro level of actually looking at some policy changes is communicating what I believe in. I think there has to be a massive paradigm shift in what it is that we're even talking about here. And I'm a long-term abolitionist, but I do reform work in the meantime till we get there, because it changes lives. You change one life, you change the world, and there's no telling which policy prevented an individual from a disparate outcome and their life changed completely differently, or saved the life from them being shot and killed by law enforcement. So what I mean by paradigm shift is that, let's look at prison, for instance. Prison is punitive. And so you go into prison, you send an individual that is high off the charts on ACEs scores, adverse childhood experience, such as myself. I went into prison at the age of 16, spent 5 years in there to the age of 25 at youth institutions where violence was normative. You know, I remember on the 10th floor in the high rise, the officers made us fight every Friday. It was called Friday night fights. They would clear out the hallway, pick 2 individuals out, you go down this hallway and fight. And this is just like one instance of how inhumane prison is. And so you're traumatizing individuals, and then you're expecting a better outcome when they get it back out into society. Like, that doesn't even make sense. You're not gonna be able to make that make sense for me. And then you throw them back out into society and you have all of this discrimination, you have all of this racism, and you have all of these things that are pitted against these individuals. There are resources available, but because the prison system is not constructed properly to where it actually focuses on healing individuals and not traumatizing them over and over again, they get out and they haven't even been connected to the resources. They don't even know what's available to them. Like, the things that I know now that are actually available to incarcerated individuals, when I stepped foot back into free society in 2018, I ain't know none of those things existed. I had a $45 gate check, and I had to pretty much figure it out on my own. There was no assistance for me other than me getting out there and trying to figure out where the different pieces to the puzzle was. So again, the paradigm shift looks at, for me, which I think is a very long way off, and reason why I don't just come out and I'm not out here advocating for this paradigm shift, because I think that it would be a little bit ineffective for me to even go down this road, because we have to look at the carceral system for what it truly is, and it re-traumatizes individuals. Now, if we shifted the paradigm and we looked at it as each individual going inside of this system itself is in there for a different reason. You know, some of my reasons for going in there was because I couldn't figure out how to make a sustainable income in a constructive society. So just based off that, right? If we look at an individual and why they're in there and we try to give them the services and things that they need to be successful, if you have individuals with mental issues, if you have individuals that have certain ACEs scores or certain adverse childhood experiences, and you try to address and heal those before they get back out, instead of the carceral system being strictly about, you know, punitive outcomes. I spent a long amount of time in solitary confinement. Then you have the whole industrial complex thing, where a lot of it is about money. You know, in different states, you know, North Carolina has done pretty good about getting rid of privatized prisons, but the prison system still makes a whole lot of revenue off of prisons. But in other states, you have a lot of privatized prisons that make a massive amount of money off of inmates coming in, and money can be used to leverage and influence policymakers and politicians. And so it's going to take several paradigm shifts and shifts in thinking to truly get to where I think we need to be, with actually decreasing disparities and recidivism inside the criminal system. I just put that because it's definitely not justice. And so, but to get into the policies, I believe that all 123 recommendations that the Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice came up with were amazing. Some of the ones that I really like to highlight, though, would be funding grassroots organizations that employ promising and peaceful strategies to help communities promote public safety, develop and provide funding to help communities build violence prevention programs, form local community safety and wellness task forces to examine public safety and wellness needs, publicly acknowledge mistakes by law enforcement to build trust and transparency in community, and all 15 of the police accountability recommendations. And like I said, I believe that all of them are very important, but these truly stick out to me because this is where you start investing in community to start solving its own issues and decreasing its own rates of crime without having to employ more law enforcement. Like, we look at law enforcement as that's the solution to crime, when there are so many different reasons why individuals are committing crime, and we look at law enforcement as if they're the solution for all crime. And that's a fallacy, if you ask me. And I just think it's super important that we start investing in communities and actually getting out and educating community about what's possible. You know, there are several models available, such as Cure Violence is one that's real popular in North Carolina. I think that those models need to be basically expanded and made specific and tailored to each and every locality. Each locality is going to be different, where you have individuals that are actually truly proactively preventing murders. I've never experienced a law enforcement individual coming up and, you know, necessarily stopping a crime before it happens, say like, and what I mean by that, of course, they stop plenty of crimes. What I mean by that is, say, two individuals are having a dispute within a community, and there is a suspicion that one individual is going to kill another individual. You know, law enforcement only has very specific tools. You know, they can lock you up, they have guns, they have tasers, they can talk and put fear in you, like, hey, we know that you're arguing and we're going to have our eyes on you. But at the end of the day, that's not really solving the issue. A lot of the programs that I've been around and I've been learning from, they are using trusted community individuals to proactively prevent these situations from happening, which saves lives at the end of the day.
Rob, have you seen any of those programs in North Carolina?
Yes, sir. One of the ones that I'm really researching closely to make it very specific and tailored to Asheville would be Cure Violence. I just had a meeting with all of their leadership last week, and we're trying to take pieces and parts from it so that we can implement it here and tailor it to our community and see how we can make it work for us similarly. there are also a whole lot of policies that need to be changed in order for the things that I'm speaking on to be truly implemented in the correct way. But I truly think we should start investing in community initiatives.
Well, to get those things started requires a certain boldness and leadership at the community level. And I
True.
think we're going to talk more about that. But when you talk about paradigm shifts, and you describe all the ways in which the legal system does not pursue justice, we really do need to stop calling it a criminal justice system, don't we?
Yes, criminal
what it
injustice.
is, it's a legal system that creates structures that prevent justice. And I think Justice Earl talked about 91, I forget the exact statistic, but 91% of the juveniles serving life sentences, or I forget if it was life sentences or extreme sentences, were folks of color. This does not happen by accident. And much of what we learned at the task force was these problems are knowable and there are solutions that are available to them, but there does require a certain amount of boldness and a willingness to pursue those kinds of transformations. And Dr. Arriaga, that sort of brings us to some of the common matters in public discourse right now about how big and bold do we go. Some people believe that reform within the current system of police and prisons isn't possible or sufficient, and instead call for an end to the current system of policing, that is, defund the police or abolish prisons. What changes could a community implement to get them closer to community safety? And can you explain the difference between community safety and public safety?
Yeah, and thank you, Rob. I think so many of the points you covered were spot on. And I'm a little bit upset. I need to go after that. But yeah, absolutely. I think that there's so many different ways to think about sort of what do we do next. And I think often we lack imagination when it comes to what can we do instead, right? I think some of us, and I often use the example of sort of even ICE, right? So Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that hasn't been around all of our lives, right? It's a pretty sort of contemporary sort of agency that was established. And so for me, I also think about community safety is exactly what Rob was talking about, right? So what is it that community needs in this moment? How are we actually like paying attention to what that is? I do community-based participatory research. And so for me, that's actually central to any type of sort of policy conversation I want to have, right? It's actually going back to the community members who I grew up with or sort of other folks and really thinking about what is it that sort of they're wanting in this moment. If folks don't know the work of Spirit House out in Durham, North Carolina, I encourage folks to look up a YouTube video by Ania Wilson, who talks about this idea of community safety. So not as sort of this idea of public safety, which I think is very much the sort of state language, right? That if someone in the chat was talking about language, public safety is very much sort of this like invitation to think about the carceral state, I think, in it. I think community safety is just so different, right? So I think if you're talking about sort of community safety, you're going into communities, you're asking them what exactly is it that they need. And most of the time, they're not going to say that law enforcement's at the top of their list, right? So they're going to talk about the things that Rob was talking about, which is housing, right? They're going to talk about sort of better schools, all of these things that we as community members do have, I think the power to actually make some changes about, right? These are sort of localized solutions to this. I'll also say too that there is, I'm going to drop it in the chat for everyone. There's also, I think, this push from community members, especially community members who aren't excited to have this conversation about defund or divestment, to sort of ask people who are the most directly impacted, what exactly is the alternative, right? Or what is sort of the other thing that needs to be built? And I do want to make sure that we feel comfortable saying that we actually don't know, right? I feel like every day we're actually creating experiments, not just sort of regarding sort of community safety, but just in general. And so I think that there's different ways that we can think about this, because I think one model isn't maybe going to work in other places, right? So I think violence interrupters is definitely one example that I think folks have been trying to figure out sort of what's the, how is that impacting communities, right? I think some of the other things that we've seen across at least North Carolina is some of those wellness and safety task forces, right? So in Durham, I was fortunate to be politicized in some ways in Durham, and very much sort of push on sort of the increase in funding for policing when there was no sort of, for us, there was no real sort of evidence that policing was working, right? And so I think that doing some of that community canvassing, understanding what communities are actually asking for is what people are asking for, right? I think that for some people, the sort of idea of abolition is this sort of boogeyman, this sort of like very loaded word. And I think if you ask most abolitionists, they actually think about it in a few different ways, right? So abolition can be a way of seeing the world, which means that you're actually thinking about how do we actually be in community with each other. Abolition is an organizing strategy, which is a little bit different, right? That's really going to be, is this campaign going to be a reform campaign, or is this campaign going to actually try to get rid of those systems that we have currently? And then I think the third is abolition is the way that we live our daily lives, right? So for some people, and specifically, I want to say like in my community, especially I grew up in a mixed status family, meaning that for us, calling the cops was also potentially calling ICE, right? And so for us, calling the cops meant that that was going to potentially start this process that I didn't know much about until I started studying it, especially in my own community, right? So I do think that our communities have the answers to what actually keeps us safe in a way that often I think the way that sort of like the criminal justice system and policies get created is in a sort of a vacuum of folks who aren't necessarily impacted by those policies, right? And I think for so many folks, the community sort of safety piece is very different than sort of the public safety component, which is really meant, I think, to protect certain groups of society, right? I think we can sort of, we all know, hopefully, that, and this is really relevant to folks in the South, is that so much of our current sort of law enforcement system, carceral system in the South was very much meant was constructed as slave catchers, right? Trying to actually sort of uphold that system. And I also want to say that even for folks in the North, the sort of initial sort of push was that any white person was supposed to be turning over enslaved people, right? And so I also want to caution us when we think about sort of that component of like the history of law enforcement, to also make sure we recognize that white people also have a stake in upholding some of these systems, right? So many of us are sort of implicit, complicit in some of these conversations. And I want us to also think about what can we do as local community members to really try to figure out what does community safety look like that doesn't necessarily rely on sort of an outside institution, as Rob was pointing out before.
Thank you. You've touched on some of those most divisive issues in public discourse. How do we start this dismantling of this carceral system? How do we work towards abolition of prisons or reorienting public safety and police departments? One of the frustrating parts of the task force is even those who are interested in reform couldn't get their minds or hands around how you can create even interim steps of police accountability. Can we get rid of the warrior mentality? Can we replace that with the training with more of the guardian or servant mentality? These were fought, there were major battles over whether or not we could make strong recommendations even on some of those simple questions. And that sort of brings the ball back to you, Senator. When you think about the General Assembly, has the state legislature enacted any of the task force recommendations to address the racial disparities in the legal system? What has been adopted? What do you see as being possible? What is the role of the legislature and the legislative process here?
So Henderson, let me start by saying I'm serving in my second term in the North Carolina Senate, representing Mecklenburg County, an urban area. I'm a Democrat. And our North Carolina General Assembly is heavily dominated by Republicans. We have a Democratic governor, but we have a majority Republican state legislature. And essentially they are in the driver's seat at the end of the day. They decide which way we're going to turn, which way we're not going to turn. And the best that you can do is try to advocate them, try to nudge them, give them the best guidance and direction as possible until when you, the people who are listening, begin to make changes within your own community. What I will say is, first off, hats off to folks like you, Henderson, and Justice Earls and Josh Stein and Attorney General Stein and so many members of our task force on racial equity in our justice system and the 125 recommendations that we came up with. Of course, even with the recommendations, we would have liked to go further. We would have liked to go further in the state legislature. But I want to specifically thank you, the folks out there who are listening, all the organizers, the advocates. It's because of all your blood, sweat, and tears that we are where we're at. Why we're having this conversation even today, and why we have, at the end of the day, been able to make some progress. What I will say is, while some of us would like to see this bill, Senate Bill 300, which is essentially the broad criminal justice bill that the state legislature passed, it doesn't go far enough at the end of the day, of course, and we still have a lot more work to do. But I will tell you, a lot of the provisions that we passed in Senate Bill 300 and that the governor already signed into are long overdue provisions. A lot of them are fresh takes on accountability. But I will tell you, I'm hopeful because the North Carolina General Assembly, in a bipartisan fashion, at least acknowledged that our system needs improvements. And that's an important first step. Trust me, I'll tell you, being in this North Carolina General Assembly, where we're at. And obviously, I hear the comment, still not enough, and I agree with you. So hopefully we'll work together, but I do want to highlight some of the proposals here, Henderson, that our task force worked on that did end up in Senate Bill 300. We're looking at strengthening community policing practices. So we've expanded in Senate Bill 300 mandatory in-service training on, for example, mental health topics to law enforcement professionals, how to build community policing relationships, looking at and requiring a duty to intervene and duty to report, which was critical in places like Minnesota, which you saw what happened to George Floyd. I will tell you, we're finally getting a use of force database. I would have liked to see a public database, but unfortunately, they've made that a private database. But at least we're beginning to track that data related to critical incidents and that use of force incidents with law enforcement agencies. Side note, the North Carolina General Assembly today, in the state budget, in a little provision that they released last night to all of us, passed a law that's saying that no state law enforcement agency can create a public database related to use of force incidents without the consent of the North Carolina General Assembly. That's in the state budget, tucked in to 600 something pages. So that's disheartening. We're also looking at creating some sort of requiring State Bureau of Investigations to investigate use of force incidents. That's there. The FBI's RAP Back program, which is the record of arrests and prosecutions. So when police officers are going from different jurisdictions or state to state, that type of information will be available and tracked by the State Bureau of Investigations. We're looking at requiring police officers and law enforcement agencies to come up with best practices guides to recruit and retain diverse workforces. Additional expanded mandatory in-service training, requiring police officers to finally get a psychological screen. I'm surprised that we didn't require that before, but apparently we're finally now requiring police officers to get in-person psychological and mental health screenings before they're sworn police officers. Important provision that I'm thrilled that is included in Senate Bill 300 is a lot of our local governments contribute because of local ordinances to the criminalization of poverty. For example, sleeping on a park bench or failure to pay fares. But essentially the General Assembly created a defense where if you don't pick up a new criminal charge or figure out some way to address your underlying conditions related to mental health, substance abuse, employment, now that criminal charge could get dismissed. A lot of local governments pushed back. Of course, the Sheriff's Association, the Police Chiefs Association, who are heavy players when it comes to justice reform. They were in heavy opposition to any thorough reforms to our local ordinances. So we made some progress there. First appearances, that's huge. So finally folks can get counsel so they can get legal representation. Hopefully they can get home to their jobs and home soon enough requiring first appearances within 72 hours. One of the issues that I'm still concerned about, that I still get heartburn about, is that, and we've proposed bills as Democrats about public release of body cam footage. You saw what happened in Andrew Brown Jr.'s case, where the family got essentially 20 seconds of redacted footage. They deserve better. Every single family in North Carolina deserves better. Imagine if you're a father, a son, an aunt, uncle, you want to know what happened in the final moments of your loved ones. And I think that we can continue to move the ball here. And the way the system is set up for public disclosures, public releases of body cam footage, you're essentially sending the public, organizations like the ACLU, other activist organizations, the media, into the lion's den, having them putting the burden on the community to request body cam footage. And I think that's wrong. The burden should be on our law enforcement agencies. And we submitted legislation, but unfortunately, that went to the Rules Committee by this Republican-dominated legislature. Rules Committee is where the bills go to die. So these bills didn't even get a debate, much less a floor vote. But I will tell you, inside of Bill 300, we at least give our family members who have suffered loss an opportunity to get access to body cam footage. They essentially they'd have to request a notarized form. A judge at that time would have to make a decision within 3 days to limit or redact that body cam footage before it's released, disclosed to the family. And then after that, I believe the judge has at least 20 days to reevaluate their decision if they have heavily redacted or limited that video. But those are some of the reforms that we made. Again, I think that we can continue to do a lot more work to take this work further. I think the task force can continue to do a lot more work to take this work further. But at the end of the day, it's up to our community, right? The urban areas of the North Carolina General Assembly are made up of Democrats who are considered to reform. And I'm not trying to get partisan here, but here's the reality. A lot of the work we want to do is falling on deaf ears. And until we build coalitions across this state, from Eastern to Western North Carolina, and bring about change agents who are excited about bringing genuine policy recommendations to the floor and having fierce debates, we're still going to be where we're at, and we're going to have baby steps when it comes to reforms. But I'm excited to work with organizations like the ACLU, the folks that are listening. My door's always open, happy to listen to any conversations, ideas, thoughts anybody would have, because we still have a lot of work to do as far as getting our state to a much more just justice system.
Thank you, Mataba. Yeah, just listening to you reminds me of myself. And, you know, part of the flaws with being a lawyer is that we work within systems and we try to make systems work. And when you said that it was disheartening to hear about this midnight passage of the budget bill with this anti-data provision, I mean, disheartening doesn't begin to address you know, the needs that are system-wide to know the ways in which people of color, poor folks, African Americans are at the receiving end of injustice by structures we have designed. And yeah, I can remember, Justice Earl, one of the comments from the public sessions that was most poignant was made from outside of one of the prisons. You know, just a family member calling in from outside, and it was just hearing the pure hurt and pain that the system was imposing on her loved one. It just sort of wiped away all the legalisms and all of the administrative and bureaucratic defenses that are out there, and just sort of raises up the need for transformation. And I think, Mataba, you said it at the end of your remarks, that it's going to have to be led by community activism and leadership, yeah, at the community level. That's clearly what we need. You know, Justice Earls last summer was a very special time, I thought, for the state. You know, listening to former Chief Justice Beasley's remarks in the summer of last year were powerful and encouraging to people, not only in North Carolina, but across the state. So the question posed to you is, yeah, how do you think we can accomplish the changes necessary to eliminate racism in the legal system? For example, in September, Judge Griffin from the Court of Appeals in 2020 wrote that the law is colorblind and applies equally to every citizen in the United States. What, if anything, can be done about judges who don't believe that racism exists in the criminal legal system or that race has no impact on outcomes.
I was just going to say, as a former voting rights advocate, I, of course, have to first turn to voting. And that is one way that in our democracy, we still believe you can hold elected officials accountable. And in our state, we elect our judges. So I think that there are some who, when a judge disagrees with them, they say the judge should be impeached. I don't agree with that. I think that we can use the ballot box, but more fundamentally, so this is where I really want to go back to something that Rob said about these interacting systems, because I think that we can change hearts and minds. That we do have to understand the point of view of those who are opposing reform, and that we can try to engage with them. And so why does this relate to systems? Because so the current Chief Justice has established a commission on ACEs informed courtrooms. And he is engaging with this concept of adverse childhood experiences. And he recognizes that even though he himself, he believes, grew up in modest means, he scores 0 on the ACEs scale. And I think it sort of opened his eyes somewhat to the fact that there are people in different circumstances. The current head of the Administrative Office of the Courts, in introducing this ACEs informed courtroom project to the judiciary, talked about his vision of how, there's 3 keys to success. As long as you graduate from college, get a job, and get married before you have kids, you'll be successful. And that was his vision of what it takes in our society. And I think we have to counter that with the vision of, well, we don't have a system that gives everyone equal opportunity to a sound basic education right now, or even a quality education. We don't give people jobs with livable wages that allow them to support their families. And we don't have policies that support families in our state. And so if we can get people to think about the systems instead of their own concepts of, well, this is how I made it, so this is how everyone can make it. I think that's a start. But really what I'm getting at is that we can talk about policies. But one of our task force members famously said repeatedly that culture eats policy for lunch. Her point being that we can have all the great policies in the world, but if we don't have a culture that is supporting them, they won't have the effect that we want them to have. So what about our culture? Right now we have a culture where people believe that the measure of the life of a victim is how long the person who injured them stays in prison. And that just seems to just be ingrained in people, as well as sort of the prison system is how we punish, and we have to punish in order to show respect for the lives of the victims. And yet when you talk to victims advocates, they will tell you that having gone through the criminal justice system, that did not give them closure. It did not give them healing. It didn't serve their needs. And so there's just a lot that we have to do to change our culture around how we should respond. And this is where, reimagining community safety and reimagining how we deal with harms that occur is so important. So the restorative justice initiatives really can make a difference. And the final thing I want to just answer is this question. There was very early on in the chat a question about what can we do to promote bail reform. And I just want people to know that in North Carolina, there are some demonstration projects in certain counties. And so I would say, ask your county to get in touch with the School of Government and get them to look at doing a project in your county. And what they're doing is working with magistrates, working with pretrial services, so that people getting released, not having bail set, and then they're measuring all that, and they're showing that people do come back for their trials, they don't lose their jobs, and the jail, the county saves money by not having to incarcerate people. So there are some. So I think focusing on some of the promising projects that really can happen at the local level is a really important way to try to make a difference.
Yeah. And such truth in that. And, Rob, you had started to talk about the intervention projects that have been successful, even in some experimental pilot projects here. Clearly, they've proved successful outside of the state. Can you expand on this a bit? Your view, can the system be changed from the bottom up or at the local level? Yeah. How do we foster the political will to make these transformative changes? From the citizens themselves, how do we influence local sheriffs and police chiefs? How do we get involved in those local institutions? What's your suggestion for how the community can lead the transformation that we deserve?
Starting with teaching the truth about everything. Because, I'm lucky to be in a city that's a blue oasis inside of a red desert. The rest of the state is very much like Senator Muhammad stated. And, I'm gonna take my abolitionist hat off and put on my reformist hat so that I can fit into this space more comfortably. So I fully agree with everything that Senator Muhammad was saying as far as the politics behind the policy changes, right? And this is related to a lot of narrative control, where individuals don't believe that racism exists inside of these systems, where individuals don't believe that individuals are being oppressed and discriminated against and creating disparate outcomes. So I think that, to be honest, there are a lot of hearts and minds that are not going to change because the way that the system is currently set up and structured protects and benefits them. So we need to focus on the next generations. Like I said, the changes I look to see, I won't be alive to see it most likely. And so we've got to focus on laying the foundation for the next generation, because the next generation that I've been engaging with are highly different animals. I'm telling you, they're on it. They are seeking this information of their own volition. And we will have a different makeup within the next couple of decades when these individuals get into these seats. And right now, all we can do is try to strategize with individuals like Senator Muhammad. It's always good to have inside people being outside activists, right? And we give them the political capital by organizing and mobilizing community members in a specific form and fashion that puts pressure on the individuals that are against them, so that they can then present something that looks like a tailor-made solution to the situation. And so sometimes we get lucky and it's organic, authentic political capital that is created that a senator is then able to cash in on some drastic policy changes. But that usually is not the case. We usually have to create it ourselves. And it's best done when you have people inside the system working with individuals outside the system. And the best way to do that is you weaponize these metrics, these disparities, you put it everywhere, and you make individuals see this stuff everywhere to where they can't ignore it. And you fully explain why this is happening. And you got a campaign. And this goes back again to funding our organizations, because police budgets are multi-million-dollar monsters. My organization, we don't even have $1 million. You know what I mean? We don't even have $500,000. And so what I'm out here doing is with a community of volunteers. And I wouldn't be able to do anything if I wasn't in a wonderful, amazing community of people that actually cared about what's going on. If I was in Madison County or somewhere like that, this would be a whole different ball game. And so I missed a part of your question, sir. Could you restate part of it, please?
I don't know that you missed any part of any question, Rob. I mean, I think you touched on real truth there. And so much attention has been placed on, are we abolitionists or are we reformists? And well, I think what you've done is you've cut through that and said there are real lives at stake that need to be changed. And I can't even begin to summarize the truth that you spoke. I can only say that judging from the chat, we all received it. And I think, sort of as a closing challenge to the panelists, maybe building on what you said, is what can we do as community leaders? What can we recommend to our community, to community members? How do they get involved? How do we get real people in the midst of all the things that they've got to do to survive? How do we get them focused on changing the legal system that continues to put their knees on the neck of our communities?
Is that a question for me?
Well, no, I'm looking for some of the other panelists to build on what you've said. Dr. Arriaga, let's start with you.
Yeah, and I actually, I think Rob will hopefully come back and tell us more about the Government Accountability Project that Racial Justice Coalition is working on too, because I do think that for me, I think being in Durham during my doctoral work, I was hoping that organizations there had a better handle on that. I feel like I can say that now. And that's actually one of the reasons that we started to work with sort of Durham Beyond Policing, was actually just showing up to city council and county commissioner meetings to actually better understand the budgets that Rob talked about before. And so for me, that's not anything that I thought I would be doing for my dissertation work, for my sort of community-based work. But it became so central to, I think, understanding what it actually means to hold local officials and local electeds accountable. So I do think that sort of these steps, and I also say that some of these steps, and maybe Rob could definitely tell me more about what it looks like in Asheville, is that I think there's steps for like white people who should at least who have the time, right? I feel like on some of the boards I'm on some of the sort of community groups I'm in, there's a lot of folks here who have a lot of time on their hands. And I think using that energy to be able to do those things that actually working people sometimes can't take the time off of work to do is really important, right? So I think being sort of led by Black leadership in particular, I'm fortunate to work with a nonprofit that specifically is Black led, which is the Black Leadership and Organizing Collective of North Carolina. And for me, that looks like taking leadership and taking sort of responsibility as a sort of non-Black person in that space, right? So I think it really does sort of think there's like directions for folks who are community members who are directly impacted, and given all of the sort of different situations of their lives that I think Rob specifically touched on, and thinking about sort of how that's interconnected. So I really think that that's one sort of aspect of steps for those people to be involved. But then there's also, I guess, like the other sort of space where people who are into sort of voting, electoral politics, who are really excited about that. I'll also say that plenty of immigrants I know aren't allowed to vote. So for me, it's not such a central part of, I think, my organizing strategy in the community, or even sort of the research that I do, because so many people can't vote, right? It would be great if we had maybe some local innovative ways to actually allow people to vote who are immigrants in sort of localized elections, which is possible. There's sort of like these pieces that I really do think that if we're thinking about sort of the voting strategy, I think that's super important, especially given that the DA races, sheriff elections are coming up next year. I think that's really important for folks to get involved in, and to make sure that we're creating space and accountability systems that go beyond the election, right? I think that that's where we get stuck, is that, okay, great, this person gets elected, they go into office at the end of December of that year, and then potentially we don't see anyone, right, sort of knocking at their door, paying attention in the way that we would if we continue to have sort of accountability structures in place ongoing. And that also, I think, centered people who are directly impacted, right? Because those are the folks who feel the real impacts of this on a daily basis. And so it's unfair, and I think irresponsible for us who maybe aren't in those positions to then sort of take time away from that accountability. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that we need to do better about really sort of maintaining that, and thinking of the way that we're privileged, right? So I'm a professor, I have a lot of privileges that sort of community members that I work with do not. And so I also recognize that there's sort of going to be differences in the way that we go about the work that we do in community, and even on our day-to-day sort of work as well.
Thank you. Mutawa, Rob takes pride in being from Asheville. Now, how can two Charlotteans take that, quietly? We've got an African-American sheriff, we've got an African-American district attorney, we've got a county commission that's dominated by folks of color. We've got you in the legislature. We got a African-American woman as mayor. What's missing? How do we engage? How does the community engage political leaders to act more boldly on the agenda that we've been talking about for the last hour?
Yeah, and just look, I'm very proud of the Queen City and Charlotte and the wonderful representation we have there. And what I believe is missing is the people at the end of the day. It's the folks out there. Yes, there's great people out here on this call today, on this wonderful panel. I see a number of organizers on this Zoom call here tonight who are doing a lot of great work in our community, but we need more people to get out there, roll up their sleeves and do some work, to begin to see ourselves and our neighbors. And what I begin to always think about is, as a student of history, is our civil rights movement for me, right? I can't begin to even imagine the setbacks, the roadblocks, and the closed doors, and so much fierce opposition that was felt while folks were fighting for civil rights, labor rights, and economic justice rights. I think about how many ordinary people who are probably out here listening today from home or at work or wherever they are, and they're like, maybe we should just stop. Maybe we should give up. Maybe I should just turn off the Zoom call and turn on the TV or get on social media or get on TikTok or Instagram Reels and do my thing and call it a night. But then I think about that there's people out there that didn't give up and that realized that we still had much more work to do, much more progress to make. And then I realized about how much further we have come. And I have to always take into account that the advances that came is because those people didn't give up, like abolishment of slavery, voting rights for women and Black and brown Americans, desegregation of our schools. Now we're slowly coming back to that, the way things are designed. But we've got to make sure that we stay vigilant, stay engaged, and stay informed as community citizens. We've got to be able to continue to organize and mobilize at every level of government. And Washington, D.C. and Raleigh does not have all the answers, right? A lot of the decisions about our daily lives are made in school board meetings, county commissions, city councils. And folks need to realize that elections don't happen every 4 years. There's 2 elections every single year. There's primaries, there's general elections. You've got to be able to hold people accountable. My mother always taught me just because somebody looks like me doesn't mean they're necessarily looking out for me either. So you got to be able to hold folks accountable, research them, understand them, engage with them, organize at all levels of government to bring changes all the way from the White House down to our state house, down to our district courts. I mean, there's so many local community organizations that make endorsements of candidates. Oftentimes those are done by establishment people who've been around for quite some time. So you got to get involved at that basic level. You got to figure out, how does fundraising to a campaign work? How does volunteering on a campaign work? That's how you got to build systematic change. Otherwise, the policymakers aren't going to pay attention to you. The reality is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's the truth. So you got to get out there, roll up your sleeves, and honestly, excuse my language, you got to start giving start giving a damn. You got to stop just working 9 to 5 or worrying about your own family or your own street and your own neighbors and your own child's school. We've got to begin to care about every single child across our city, across our county, across our state, and across our country. That is how we begin to change the world, by taking ownership as human beings and realizing that we're brothers and sisters. So it's at a very basic level, Henderson. What's missing is the people. And that's why that's why you haven't seen the change that we so desperately need. And real lives are at stake. You heard me talk about it at the very beginning. Real lives are at stake. And you never know, it could be someone's life that you know. So everything's on the line. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm mindful of the clock and of the fact that the chat has been very active, and I've only been able to scan some of them. I must note that a former mayor of Charlotte contributed and pointed the finger towards the business sector and the business community. And in Charlotte, they do carry a lot of weight. But that's all I'm going to say about that. Thank you, Mayor, for those comments. But Daniel Bose has agreed to sort of curate some of the questions that have been floating through through the chat. I know there've been some impressive comments and questions. And so I'd like to, at this point, turn it over to Daniel to lift up some of those comments and questions.
Yeah, thank you, Henderson. And thank you to all the panelists. What a wonderful conversation. There's been, that's about the most active chat that I've seen. Like I was, I was getting stressed out trying to capture it all. So really appreciate it. There's people posting resources in the chat. You know, for example, when you talked about the businesses that benefit from mass incarceration, there was a great resource that was posted that listed the 12 corporations that do profit from mass incarceration. So I would urge you to look at the chat for the resources. In terms of the questions, you know, a lot of people were asking how to get involved, how to push this, and I appreciate that last round of answers around that. So, but that is really what most people were interested in, is how can I specifically push this policy agenda, whether it's Senator Mohammed's specific agenda or the recommendations of TREC. And so again, I appreciate y'all addressing that. One other issue was earlier, Justice Earls talked about the need for people to be in prison for shorter amounts of time. And there was a question about sentencing reform, you know, just not advancing, despite it being a pretty bipartisan issue with the First Step Act a couple years ago. I remember Brent Jackson in the Senate making this profound speech, but it's not gone nearly far enough. And we've had truth in sentencing that requires people to serve 80% of their sentences today. Can panelists talk about how we get people who are either currently in prison or about to go to prison to be there for a much shorter amount of time? And I'll pose that, can I pose that to first Senator Mohammed, and then Justice Earls, and then make the round.
I mean, Daniel, great questions. You and I get the honor of working together often at the North Carolina General Assembly. By the way, folks, for the ACLU team out there, Daniel Bose is a fantastic asset to your team, and it's an honor and pleasure to work with you, Daniel. Like, so look, one of the biggest things is, like, for example, today I reached out to Daniel when we met with Secretary Buffalo of DPS's new secretary, and I reached out to our community activists. What are some solutions that we can begin to talk about on a local level, or on a statewide level, or federal level? I often try to do that to the best of my ability. And for example, when you have an organization like DPS that has executive authority, well, we can try to make internal reforms without having to go through the state legislative route. So we talked about trying to work at efforts to reduce our prison populations to the best of our ability, especially based on COVID. Talking about the shortage that we have in correctional officers, and realizing that you don't necessarily have to be so concerned about the shortage of those correctional officers if you don't have so many people occupying those jails and prisons, especially extended limits of confinement. Thank you, Daniel, for titling that. I mean, those are the types of reforms that we can, I think, continue to push on a local level, but we've got to continue to push on a statewide legislature our level as well. I mean, this General Assembly that I serve in, Daniel, you've seen it. We often like to look at ratcheting up felonies, figuring out how to come up with more punitive measures. Again, we're building a prison instead of building people at the day in North Carolina. So we've got to be able to reach out to our local elected officials and our local governments and our state legislators and demand genuine changes, and realizing that our criminal justice system is contributing to a lot of these problems, and that we're not going to stand for any more felonies and prison sentences and punitive measures, because this isn't keeping our community safe. It isn't helping our law enforcement community. It isn't helping anyone. That is not the answer. But I mean, the only thing I can think about is continue to advocate, continue to have conversations, and continue to be engaged. At the end of the day, keep a watchful eye, like you do so well, Daniel, and so many other. Don Blakero's on here with Emancipate NC. So many other amazing folks who are continue to stay involved at a local level to do this great work. It's the conversations are critical.
Justice Earl, were you poised to respond? I do want to elbow in some part of this conversation at some point, Daniel. But Justice Earl,
I'll be very brief. Very brief. I think being informed and being here this evening and learning about what's going on is really important, and then spreading the word. So, for example, the governor appointed a juvenile sentence review commission. He appointed 3 people to look at the sentences of people sentenced when they were juveniles. Anyone who's, I think it's been in custody now for 15 years or longer. They are overwhelmed with the number of cases they should be reviewing, but they have begun to make recommendations to the governor. If the governor's office heard from folks like you saying, "Hey, governor, thank you for appointing that commission. I hope you're going to take their recommendations seriously." I personally, I think that is a way to keep elected officials accountable. And I also heard you about some folks don't have the right to vote, but just because you can't vote doesn't mean you can't keep elected officials accountable. Because if you are following what they're doing, asking the right questions, I feel like we need a whole other panel on how you keep judges accountable. But I would just say, don't underestimate your own power. Even if you don't have the money, the General Assembly appropriated, I think I'm right, Senator Mohammed, $3 million to the Sheriff's Association so that the Sheriff's Association could lobby them. So is it any surprise that the Sheriff's Association has huge amounts of power in the system? I think we ought to give the Racial Justice Coalition $3 million so they can lobby the General Assembly. But the point being that money is one source of power, but there are other sources of power as well. And if you learn your sources of power, you can make a difference.
Absolutely. The one point I wanted to add to this part of the conversation, Daniel, is that we haven't spoken as much about the district attorneys in the state. They are elected officials. They are powerful officials in the legal system, the criminal legal system. They've got immense discretion. And when we talk about clawing back some of the outrages of the last couple of decades of mass incarceration, district attorneys have a lot of discretion to review some of those old sentences that were extreme, that a jury in your county would no longer abide in 2021. But we've got people serving life sentences, 20, 30, 40-year sentences, whereas under the current community view, those people would be out at home, reintegrated in the community. And so I do think that district attorneys ought to be a focus of community action, of votes, and of the bar. I started an initiative called Redress North Carolina, in part to encourage the bar to take cases to the district attorneys in their counties where the sentences are extreme and file motions for appropriate relief. You negotiate, work, collaborate with the district attorney to get some of these outrageous sentences modified. It's incremental, it's one individual at a time, but I think it creates a record, a legislative record, so that when we've got bills like the Second Chance Act, the automatic review of sentences after 15 years or after 20 years. These are not radical proposals. These are proposals from the Model Penal Code, the American Law Institute, from the Sentencing Project. I think from any responsible criminologist would say exactly what Justice Earl says. We're sending people away for altogether too long a period of time, and there needs to be some rational review of that. And the place where that rational review can happen today without any legislative change in the General Assembly is at your local DA's office.
Thank you for that. And just to connect that, there's a local DAs and then the North Carolina Conference of DAs, which is a powerful lobbying force coupled with the North Carolina Sheriff's Association. We are getting close to the end here. We're going to have Chantal Stevens, our executive director, come on in a few minutes. And I should say that I serve as the director of policy and advocacy at the ACLU, and again have the privilege of working with a lot of these panelists and see their hard work and just wish that there was more coalition supporting their work. There's more prioritization among the powers that be. And so I would end with two questions and just really open this up to the panel. And whoever really wants to speak on this. One, we talk about data and data being important, but it seems like in the United States, it's really regions and sort of what the next door neighbor is doing is really more important, because the data shows that the United States, including North Carolina, incarcerates a higher percentage of its population than any country in the world. And that's not really, that sort of outlier status, is not really talked about a lot because, we look at sort of the spectrum as California and Texas, and everything in there is sort of okay to talk about, but outside of that is just sort of foreign. So can we talk about the need to how we look at and have a more objective view of just how bad the system is? And then the other thing I would ask for whoever wants to pose it is to talk about prosecutors and just also what it means that, in order to be a Democrat who gets elected governor, you have to be the state's top cop, apparently, by being attorney general, and sort of how that influences the decisions that happen, whether they're clemency decisions or just other decisions around whether to, what sort of reforms to make. But can I actually ask that to Rob first?
Yeah, so I'm gonna do you one a little better. I'm not even gonna talk about all the metrics that I know. I'm gonna make it very personal. So if we start looking at these metrics and this data that each number represents a human life, I think, and start sharing some stories, share with you pieces of my story. When I first came into prison at the age of 16, my first 14 days was spent inside of a cell inside a Western Youth Institution that had no bathroom in it. And whenever the officers would come in, most of them were skinheads and part of the KKK, you could hear them yelling in the hallways, war chants and everything. And so we had to roll our towels out from underneath our doors to get our doors popped to go to the bathroom. Our rooms smelled like urine and feces because we would have to urinate out the window to use the bathroom. I myself have had to defecate in chip bags and cake boxes and all nature of things in order to relieve myself because officers would not open my cell door. I've seen individuals' eyeballs get knocked out of their head with something that looks similar to a wooden broomstick. I myself have been handcuffed and beaten on several occasions in solitary confinement while they used racial slurs and called me things like monkeys. I've been left in a cell for 3 to 4 days with no clothing, no food, nothing in the room but steel and concrete. It's called riding the Cadillac. And in solitary confinement. Then let's go to adult spread, 6 years. So I'm doing 6 years for a nonviolent drug offense, trafficking. It's people with sex offenses in prison for less time than what I was in there doing for. And so they send me to close custody, which is maximum security, Alexander Correctional Institution. They actually have documentaries on it. The whole time I was on this yard, I walked around with something on my person similar to a sword. And I had to use it a couple times. I also got in several different altercations because you have to kind of set the tone when you walk in there. When I first arrived at that institution, the first thing that I saw while carrying my bags on my back to my cell was an inmate beating on the glass while getting stabbed in the back. And the officers don't know what to do. They scared. They don't want to go in there. And this is the block that I was going into. That set the tone for me. And so how do you think, and this is only part of it, I ain't even get into some of the crazy stuff I've experienced inside of what we think is public safety. How does that equal public safety? Because 85% of the individuals that are currently inside of prison will be released one day, and you are traumatizing them. I'm going through therapy sessions right now to work out some of the things I experienced in prison. I have nightmares most nights during the week. And politicians and electeds and not like Senator Muhammad, not calling him out, but individuals that this stuff does not affect and they don't care. What happens when it does affect them? Well, let's see. You got the opioid epidemic, where a lot of these conservatives' children are opioid addicts. So what happens? You get reforms and all types of stuff. So this stuff doesn't really change until individuals start caring. And once we figure out how to get individuals to start caring, which I think that if we portray the truth and reality behind what is truly going on, the reality behind what individuals are experiencing, and the reality of how this is not making public safe for anybody, because you are traumatizing individuals and then sending them back in the community and wondering why crazy stuff happens. Like, come on, let's be real.
Thank you for that. Any other comments from panelists?
I mean, it's impossible to follow up Rob. But the part that we all can do is repeat some of the stories that he's described. They may not be my stories, but they're my client's stories. They're stories of the tragedies that this criminal legal system creates every day of the week. And when we bring these stories to some of the prosecutors that are in our jurisdictions, their eyes can and have been opened. I mean, sometimes it really just takes getting Rob, getting lived experiences communicated to people with the authority and the discretion to act on that. And I think that's true in the DA's office. I think there's potential for that to cut across some of the partisan divide. And this is where I'm going to sound a little naive, but I have been in places that are very conservative. When you tell stories like what Rob has described to us, they do listen. They do hear that. Sometimes only because some of their own, like you said, are facing that danger. You see it with the opioids. You see it with the insurrectionists. I practiced for 10 years in DC. The DC jail was an abomination for all those 10 years and for the 30 years after I left. The only time there's been any real judicial intervention is after January 6th. And you've got 60, politically connected folks being detained at the DC jail, all of them white. And all of a sudden the inhumane conditions have registered in front of the federal judges and before the Congress. Stories about people of color and African Americans don't register at the same level. But some of the basic stuff that Rob was talking about can cut through that, can mobilize communities and can move decision makers.
I think I just wanted to add to it, and thank you, Noel, I think posted in the chat that thank you so much, Rob. And I do want to be aware that people having to share their stories to make people feel something also feels a little bit traumatizing. And so I want to encourage that I'm not as optimistic about people changing their minds. Maybe it's just because I spend way too much time reading books or sort of history. And so I do want us to think about, right, like how do we put pressure on people that maybe doesn't have to force people who have been impacted by the criminal injustice system have to actually be front and center in a way that's re-traumatizing, right? So I think for me, like my sort of the way that I think about this is creating spaces for people to tell their story if it feels comfortable to them. But I also want to make sure that we're not taking away from this, that we need to ask Rob to come to all of our panels. He obviously has the agency to decide what to do about that. But I also think it is re-traumatizing in different ways, and sort of for me, if there's not still the sort of accountability even internally with other groups who are working together alongside each other on a regular basis, that's not going to be sufficient to change someone's mind, right? I think people have been putting a lot in the chat about profits, right? I think that's actually often sometimes where we do have more sort of bipartisan conversations is around sort of funding streams, when it's like fiscally responsible, when it's not fiscally responsible to do some of these things. And none of that means that those folks are going to change their minds, but it does mean that they're actually going to change their mind about funding something, right? So I just want to make sure that we don't leave this conversation thinking about putting people who have been justice involved as sort of tokens in spaces where absolutely they should have the opportunity to share their stories, but that can't be sort of our organizing or community-based strategy either.
Well, let me first thank everybody for participating. And Henderson, I wanted to give you a chance to say any last thoughts that you had before Chantal starts speaking. But thank you again I know each of y'all were going hard today at your day jobs and then making time here. So thank you very much for that. It means a lot to the community. Henderson.
Well, it's been an incredible conversation. I'm glad to be part of it. Thank you, Western Chapter, for inviting me. The only comment I would make would be a most immediate response to Dr. Arriaga, and to confess that my comments are more directed to the bar. That as lawyers, we are the voices of our clients. And I have always found it more persuasive not to necessarily quote chapter and verse of this statute or this case, but when I can bring the cruelty of the system to a district attorney, to some decision maker, it's the story that is compelling, and it's my role as an advocate to bring those stories to decision makers. And the challenge to the bar is not to accept, the system as a given, that we are looking at daily cruelties. We've got 17, 18-year-olds who are into the system. They're alleged to be gang members. They're given a label that then controls their every operation for the next 20, 30 years of their lives, even decades after they've lost contact with any gang affiliation, any associations, but their very existence in prison, who can visit, who they can communicate with, is all controlled by some algorithm, some protocol that never gets changed. And it's, I think, telling the story of that 17 or 18-year-old who's being held in close custody for 23 hours a day, that's the kind of cruelty and torture that DAs and legislators need to hear. And I think the bar needs to do a better job of communicating what our clients and what our communities are being put through in this criminal legal system.
And I just want to add in that I was not advocating for tokenizing anybody either. I hate the tokenism that has been applied to me. I'm actually currently trying to deconstruct it, but I am not extraordinary. That's the thing. Like, this is the norm. Like, go out in the community and go in public housing and talk to people about prison. See what you get. You ain't got to tokenize nobody. The truth is out there, but it's being covered up and hidden. People don't know what's really going on. People don't know what's really going on with law enforcement. People don't know what's really going on with discrimination everywhere. But how you get change is you put it out there. Some people start caring more, then you mobilize them strategically and organize. Organizing is a solution. But the lived experience and the stories help. But get out there. Don't tokenize me. Go to these communities. I promise you, there are worse stories than what I told you.
Thanks, Daniel. And thanks to our awesome panelists and our moderator. This was a powerful discussion, really powerful. Thank you to our guests who joined us and all of the community partners who sponsored tonight's events. Some amazing organizations helped make this evening possible, including Beloved Asheville, Carolina Jews for Justice, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Asheville, Christians for United Community, Land of the Sky United Church of Christ, YWCA Asheville, the First Congregational United Church of Christ Asheville, the ACLU Club of UNC Asheville, and of course, the Western North Carolina chapter of the ACLU of North Carolina. Everyone knows that the ACLU consistently defends the separation of church and state. But as you can see, there are numerous organizations across faiths working to address racial injustices and inequities in our state. And we really appreciate the chance to work in partnership with them. As Daniel said, my name is Chantal Stevens, and I am the Executive Director of the ACLU of North Carolina. I am fortunate that I get to work with such an amazing group of colleagues to tackle important issues every single day. You've met some of them tonight, and others are working behind the scenes to make this happen as well. Our team of litigation, lobbying, organizing, research, communications, and administrative professionals work across teams and with community partners to earn victories in some of today's most vital issues. That includes both working within and outside of the institutions and norms that shape our society. The insider work includes being at the state legislature to educate lawmakers as to why some bills that would infringe on North Carolinians' rights are a bad idea, as well as helping our elected officials know why they should support good legislation such as HB 608, also known as the Dignity Bill, which makes a number of much needed changes in how the state treats pregnant people in our jails and prisons. We shouldn't need legislation like the Dignity Bill, and we shouldn't need the governor's task force for racial equity in criminal justice. There should be no devastating and violent byproducts of the criminal legal system for us to address. There's no good reason that the recommendations of the task force haven't been implemented. There are political reasons, but those are not good reasons. There are people in power who agree that the reforms need to be implemented, but we've not yet found the courage to do what is already in their power to do. I came into tonight's conversation with a solid understanding of many of the problems that exist in our criminal legal system. And if, like me, what you heard tonight reinforced what you already knew, or you learned new things, I urge you to find ways to help reimagine the transformation we want to see and need as discussed by our panelists. If, like me, you see a legal system that desperately tears apart Black communities and families, devastates Black lives, and tears at the very fabric of our society, then I urge you to become a member of the ACLU of North Carolina or one of the many grassroots organizations in our communities doing the work to challenge and disrupt these systems of oppression. If you believe, like I do, that it is time to divest from the police and reinvest the savings in non-punitive programs that benefit public safety and health, along with other critical steps we need to take to foster the systemic change people across North Carolina are calling for, there's a place for you here at the ACLU. If, like me, you think it's time for our elected officials to muster the political will and courage to stand up to the powerful special interests that we talked about tonight, like the Conference of District Attorneys and the North Carolina Sheriff's Association that seek to maintain our existing criminal legal system that harms real people and families, I urge you to join the ACLU and participate in our upcoming vigil for freedom and racial justice. You can find more information about the vigil at decarceratenownc.com. If, like me, you find yourself frustrated by how slow our progress is, or how elected officials are often not held accountable for their actions, and inaction that perpetuates harm for our communities, sign up for the Vigil's mail-in list at decarceratenownc.com to receive opportunities to engage in what we like to call renegade advocacy, a set of tactics and strategies that includes directly confronting policymakers and law enforcement actors who are upholding the ideals and the practices of a carceral state. Thank you again for your time this evening, and I want to leave you with this. You joined this conversation for a reason tonight. Maybe you wanted to hear thoughts and ideas from some brilliant people, which we did. Maybe you were looking for some more information about what role you could play in addressing these issues. Or maybe it was some other reason that brought you here. But here you are. And together we heard clearly that addressing systemic inequity within the criminal legal system is not another normal policy debate. It can't be. It is a civil and human rights emergency. In whatever way you are able to, whether it's through joining an organization or directly demanding that our elected officials treat this issue with the urgency it deserves, I urge you not to be spectators. Don't stand on the sidelines hoping these problems will solve themselves. I hope you hear tonight's call and become part of the solution to the problems we collectively face by taking action. Thank you so much for your time spent with us.
Said you better let my people go. Said you better let my people go. children, they can't help themselves. Talking about the people